The Row today is one of the hottest quiet luxury brands, famed for its secretive celebrity ownership by the Olsen twins. But it's been a long journey to where they are today, and in fact, until very recently, the company was markedly different, likely losing millions by the year. So, why is the Row held in higher regard than other celebrity brands, and how did they end up saving their business that was doomed for failure? The Row was begun at the very tail end of 2005 when they trademarked their brand name, and their first season, Spring/Summer 07, debuted just a few months later in 2006. However, seemingly all that remains of that initial season is this single image of Ashley wearing a plaid jacket from the Spring/Summer 07 season in September 2006. But according to this Korean blog, which I later found out was basically just translating the English Wikipedia article that uses this Wall Street Journal article as their source, which we will come back to, during 2006, it was even sold in stores exclusively in Barney's and consisted of just 7 products, including silk t-shirts, satin leggings, vests, and cashmere cardigans. However, there are simply no confirmed images of this collection that I could find. There are these pictures, but the first time that they show up online is August 2007. I contacted several people about this, in fact, both from Barney's and The Row and other people involved, and so far, I've come up short. In fact, the only image we have comes from a blog named Nitralicious, run by a woman named Wendy Lamb. Wendy really followed the brand in these early days much more than others, and it's thanks to her diligence that we have this initial image, as well as, on another blog post, features of the collection from US Vogue from November 2006 and Vogue Japan's feature from March 2007, which tells us that by very early 2007, the brand was already global. So the launch, despite their claim that this was a small personal project, was actually quite sizable, and the media at the time reflects this, with the consensus of media sources seeming to think that this was them testing out the waters to see if the twins' celebrity influence was able to make the transition from merchandise aimed at tweens, such as their Walmart collaboration that apparently in combination with their other fashion merch reached sales of over $1 billion, to the young adult market. And in fairness, one can only assume that it was quite successful. You see, this was not all that they had succeeded in. In fact, they'd had quite a decent press push by just a few months later in 2007. On top of the Vogue US and Japan promo, TrendHunter.com quotes a New York Magazine promotional article. They had a promo on NBC News, Glamour España had an article that has since been removed, and even TMZ briefly mentions it as well. Though TMZ uniquely claimed that the brand is purposely void of the twins, something that all the other sources debunk, but would come to be attributed as true for the brand. They also launched in England with a party in London's department store Harvey Nichols, and they had a promotional video that was uploaded to YouTube by a third party on the 4th of October 2007, evidencing that in just over a year, the company was truly global, spanning at a minimum Japan, America, England, and Spain, and they clearly had used their industry connections and personal fame to boost the profile of the brand, regularly appearing in photo shoots, even if they didn't explicitly do an interview. Actually, despite their later claims that it was a small personal project, their involvement was so large that it became their first controversy. The New York Times ran a whole article about their involvement in the launch of the brand, pretty much claiming that they had purchased their way into the industry, and at the time, this article was quite damning. Dated July 2007, the article points out that Philip Lim had to collect his Emerging Talent in Womenswear award from the CFDA from the twins, who the articles say bought their way onto the scene less than a year prior. Lim in the article calls their involvement unfair, while Vera Wang said celebrities make it harder for, quote, real designers, both quotes that would be repeated by many, many other sources. Of course, this wasn't the first luxury celebrity line. There was Sean Jean by P. Diddy and Rocawear by Jay-Z before them. So the concept was not new, and it appears that by the time the Olsen twins started their line, designers were already frustrated by it. though I'm sure it came as an extra sting that the Olsens were getting the benefit of a celebrity brand, i.e. their core fans knew the brand was by them, they had the money to invest in themselves, they didn't need to ask for an investor, and they had media and industry connections that young designers could only dream of, while in this case, also having the ability and willingness to try to hide the fact that the brand was from them. Of course, this can be seen, as they phrase it, as a positive. They wanted the design merit to stand for itself and not be influenced by their celebrity status. And in fairness, that does make sense. It's an understandable motivation. But when partnered with the knowledge that they already had multiple global stockists, that they were actually quite vocal about starting the brand, and saw a bit of pushback from the industry because of the twins purchasing their way into the industry and using their connections to bigger their company, their claim that they wanted the design merit to stand for itself is just less believable. So the brand's reception into the industry in the first couple of years was rocky. But it seems that behind the scenes, the late Joseph Carbon, the senior vice president of product for the Row, had things actually going rather smoothly. Production had been set up in New York, and they even launched a secondary mid-priced line named Elizabeth and James. Elizabeth and James, which was named after the Olsen twins' siblings, was not technically part of the Row, but at the time it was individually branded, almost like a diffusion line, because of the mid-priced product that benefited off of the cultural capital and positioning of the Row, as well as the celebrity of the Olsen twins, who acted like a weenie connecting all of these brands together. This, of course, all comes down to the way that the businesses were set up. You see, while the Row was owned by Dual Star Entertainment, which is the Olsen twins' entertainment company that was set up by Robert Thorne when they were just 6 years old, Elizabeth and James, which launched the season after the Row in autumn-winter 07, was produced in a licensing deal with Le Coral, and as far as I could find, not through Dual Star, so potentially in a similar deal to their Walmart license. And while really the Elizabeth and James line, like the Walmart license, has nothing to do with the Row, it has the same effect as a diffusion line would do to a designer brand, in that the cheaper brands benefit off of the social capital, the celebrity factor of Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen, in order to make a higher volume of sales and indirectly fund the main line. This seems quite complicated for a new fashion company, and it is, but that's intentional to offer the company a financial security, which evidences just how large of a head start that the company was afforded by the Olsens. They had the protection of a parent company, which they had recently become the sole owners of, the willing investment of two of the richest actors of their generation, business people who have a tested CV, media connections for promotion, celebrity endorsement by themselves and by their friends, all from launch, a pseudo-diffusion line to immediately monetize their vision, retailing connections for stockists from both brands, and all of the things that come with that, like the ability to negotiate better deals than newer designers would be able to. We will come back to this in a little while, but seemingly this is the beginning of Dual Star, which I'll remind you are now solely owned by the Olsens, setting itself up as a take on the LVMH model, which in a nutshell is using entry point products to fund the company and using catwalks for promotion and legitimation. Namely, the Olsen's version being that the Row as a company adds legitimacy, the twins add promotion, and Elizabeth and James as an individually branded company brings the money. Effectively, they have made themselves the kind of business setup that will come from a business being bought by a major fashion conglomerate. So, with that in perspective, it's understandable why there was such a vocal pushback from other designers when all of this is put into perspective. This is the kind of head start that's truly impossible to replicate without millions upon millions of dollars worth of connections, and quite frankly, millions and millions of dollars. But yet, what's interesting about all of this, at least to me, was that I actually didn't know any of this before starting to research for this video. I had thought it started as a small personal project for the twins because that's how they phrase it. They were looking for the perfect t-shirt and stumbled into business. And in fairness, most businesses do have a founder story to encourage that emotional connection to the brand, so it's not unusual for brands of any caliber to embellish. But seemingly, their description is quite far from how it materialized when looking through the resources. It was set up very solidly by very wealthy people with all the resources that take designers years upon years, if not decades, to make, and they were doing so with a basics collection that was primarily made off of t-shirts and simple pieces, i.e., had very little artistic merit, at least in these early years. And yet, their expansion continued into 2008 with a launch in France, their first lookbook modeled by Lauren Hutton, a book that I can only assume promotes the brand, though I will admit that I haven't read it. I honestly didn't want to pay $40 to $60 for it, but there's a quarter of the book dedicated to fashion, so I can at least assume that they mention it. They also teased menswear that would eventually launch for the first time on September 10th, 2009 in both Barney's and Bergdorf Goodman during the very first Fashions Night Out hosted by Anna Wintour and Vogue. Though this menswear line was very short-lived, it gives an important insight into where the brand was at this point, specifically because it evidences that despite the initial pushback, the company was genuinely doing well, or at least that they wanted to look like they were doing well. Unfortunately, because of the setup of the company, we cannot know quantitatively how well it was doing, or perhaps if there was another reason for the launch, but it's minimally clear that what the row were selling, people were buying. Their stockists list had grown now to over 60 stockists globally, and the company itself had started to garner its own fan base outside of the Olsen twins' fame. And frankly, that's for good reason. Because of the finances the Olsens were able to inject, the logistics and production facilities that they were able to finance, the product was truly great in quality. I personally remember seeing the row, I think it was in Harvey Nichols, though I could be wrong, around this time, unaware that it was from the Olsens, and as a sewer myself, was blown away by the quality because it was genuinely so much better than its competitors. Career industry designers may have been jealous that the Olsens had the resources that they just couldn't achieve, but it was undeniably great product quality for an audience that truly cared about that. Especially now in the absence of Phoebe Philo, who would come to return in late 2009 for Spring Summer Celine, but her customer had already migrated to the row in her absence because they were such a similar product for the same demographic in similar stores and at just as high of a quality. And so the business held its ground in the space provided, something that is definitely not guaranteed regardless of the capital investment. In short, though the twins could afford the company a great launch, it really stayed stocked for good production and good design. The head designer at this time was Francesco Fucci, starting as the brand started, and he very quickly developed the Olsen's basics concept into a genuinely desirable product for their target market. Sure, sometimes the garments were in the same realm as the Olsen's own personal style, but it wasn't as close to their personal style as with most celebrity brands. A good example being Victoria Beckham, who we discussed last fortnight, even saw plagiarism accusations at the launch of her brand for exactly this. It is a little tricky to see, but it is clear from what we do have access to of their collections up until this point that though the garments were simple, they were purposefully simple to be desirable to their target market of 30 to 60-year-old high-powered working women. Their target market wasn't looking for shock factor nor bright colors, they just wanted well-made, simple, beautiful garments that they can both live and work in comfortably. And that is exactly what the row delivered season after season. Therefore, it is no wonder that the brand grew. They showed their first pre-collection in pre-fall 2010, Vogue started actively covering them in autumn-winter 10 after their catwalk debut. 2 years later, they won the Women's Wear Award from the CFDA and the Innovator Award from the Wall Street Journal. They opened their Tribeca studio in New York City. In 2014, they launched their first standalone store in LA. In 2016, brought on David Schultz to be the new president. Launched their second store in New York in 2016. Re-released menswear briefly in 2016 before closing it yet again, and in 2018 re-released menswear, now for the third time with Paul Helbers as head of menswear. However, though this is absolutely incredible growth for any company, none of this really means that the row was profitable. The Olsens famously rarely give interviews and even more rarely give financial figures for us to go off in this analysis. Usually we just get figures from their empire or from their parent company that say that they're worth collectively over $1 billion. But considering they had so many companies, this isn't the most useful figure. But that's not to say we don't have anything to go off, because in 2015 they did an interview with WWD where insiders estimate that they make $50 million in annual sales to have 164 points of sale and a staff of around 60. This amount in sales sounds quite high, but in perspective, that's really quite low. 50 million divided by the points of sale leaves us only at $300,000 per year per point of sale, which is quite low for a fashion brand with the stockists in the locations that they have. And then imagine all the costs involved with things like global logistics, wages, taxes, all the fixed costs like rent, and the variable costs like the cost of putting on a fashion show. There just wouldn't be much left over from that $50 million after all of these costs are taken into account. Certainly not enough to launch a second store in New York the following year. Though we cannot truly know, I'd wager that it wasn't profitable at this time. Perhaps they were breaking even, but I don't necessarily think that they were profitable, just as my assumption. Most fashion companies of this scale aren't. Famously, Victoria Beckham lost £80 million in 15 years before they turned profitable. And just for comparison's sake, they were making around $75 million and had 182 stockists before they scraped their first profitable year. And unlike Victoria Beckham, the row was in the midst of quite large growth, so that's expectedly quite expensive. So just personally, my best guess is that they weren't profitable at this time, but I also believe that that wasn't their main aim. I mentioned earlier that their business model was almost like a different take on the LVMH model, but this time with the weenie being the fame of the Olsen twins, as their fame is so large, and the entry point products being affordable, individually branded brands. And by this point, they had several. On top of the Row, which was their legitimizer, and Elizabeth & James, their mid-market label, they now launched Style Mint as their jewelry line, Olsen Boy as their mass market range, they had Patterson J. Kincaid, La Roque, they had Textile Elizabeth & James, which was a legitimate diffusion line of Elizabeth & James, which itself was a pseudo-diffusion line of the Row previously, and they had a line with Norwegian retailer Bik Bok under the name Bik Bok Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen. So, in a way, much like LVMH's catwalks that lose them millions of dollars, it's kind of okay if the Row loses the money as long as the legitimation that it brings to the other brands is worth the financial loss. But does this discredit the brand or devalue the artistic merit of the brand? In my opinion, no. They had more resources to set up, to find stockists, promote and continue in the face of potential losses, sure, and they benefited truly greatly when Phoebe Philo left the industry less than 2 months after they trademarked their brand name. But no stores were forced to stock their product, no consumer was forced to buy the product, and quite frankly, if it was bad, which it wasn't, they would never have been able to grow the legitimate fan base that they have fostered. Something that I'm attributing to the well-targeted design of the whole design team. However, while their potentially lackluster finances weren't as detrimental as they may be to other companies of a similar size, nothing could have prepared them for the pandemic of 2019-2020. This was an extremely difficult time for the company. In contrast to the way the industry insiders saw the brand as a sort of fashion darling, something that's discussed in both the panel shows on Show Studio about the brand, in this short space of time, there had arisen a lot of negative rumors about the brand. That they hired no black people, and their few Asian staff were not as financially rewarded by their work as their white counterparts, that Barney's owed them over $3.7 million when they went into bankruptcy, that they cut 50% of staff as an act of self-preservation due to rocky finances, that they sold stock to discount retailers for liquid cash, and following their president leaving and suing them for damages, other public rumors, of course, arose about what specifically he was suing them for, as the details of the case were not public. But obviously, none of that came with significant backlash or controversy, as Phoebe Philo's brand did when they launched recently. You see, at this time, the Row was still quite in the know, and frankly, it wasn't a well-known brand to the wider majority of people, keeping their fanbase largely fans of Mary-Kate and Ashley, who are more likely to be forgiving of these kinds of scandals. But of course, that's not the perspective most have on the brand today, and in fact, the perspective that we have now is quite the opposite. So what changed? Well, just as it was rumored that things were so bad at the Row that the Olsens were finally looking for outside financing or buyout offers, not wanting to sink any more money into their loss-making venture, the quiet luxury aesthetic began to herald the brand for their long minimal designs and exceptional product quality. It's hard to know whether this was a planned campaign to align the brand with quiet luxury, or if they just got lucky with the endless recommendations from people on platforms like TikTok. But regardless, quickly the Row had a whole new, younger customer base that was semi-untapped before and gave them hope from having to find alternate methods of financing. However, this is a trend, and thus the verdict is still out on whether this will really save their business, if this was the push they needed in promotion in order to be able to sell or find investors, or if this is just a flash-in-the-pan minute of success before the company falls back into rocky finances again. Personally, I would like to think that though this is a spike in awareness for the brand, that it won't be a flash in the pan. They've made such consistent aesthetic and quality control choices over the years that they well poised themselves to be ahead of the pack when minimalism inevitably came back into fashion again. Sure, it started as a celebrity brand and they put all of their efforts into it, but that's no longer the reason that they're often recommended over their competitors. It's the consistency and reliability of the Row that's perfect for their minimalist shopper that wants something to last them a lifetime. For this reason, there's certainly a good chance that the Olsens will be able to take this moment in the sun and convert that younger demographic into lifelong customers. The potential for the company right now is palpable and could genuinely see the company find the stabilization that they've been chasing for so many years. Of course, it's not guaranteed that they will be able to stay on this trajectory, especially with Phoebe Philo returning to the industry and the fact that we know that they don't want to put more of their own money into it. But for now, it's looking up, and I can only imagine just how relieving that is for the Olsens, who have now had the brand for 18 years. I'll definitely be revisiting the Row in a few years to see where it has ended up. I'd love to see them announce the brand is profitable in the foreseeable future, because though it does look good at the moment, the future is never guaranteed. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more videos like this one. Check out my beauty channel Underskin for videos like this one but about beauty brands, and a special thank you to my early access Patreon patrons for your ongoing support.